After making several videos going through different aspects of the various Nintendo franchises, I feel like I've covered almost every conceivable idea, from level designs, to amazing moments, to tough bosses, and glitches galore. However, there is one topic left that I've always wanted to look more into, leading me to create today's video about the origin of every single Nintendo franchise. I think this is truly fascinating, as many people don't know the creation stories of some of the company's most popular characters, and even I learned a lot of fun facts that I had no clue about. Oh yeah, and before I get started, my name is Copycat, and if you haven't yet, then please subscribe to my channel, and hit that bell button to stay notified when I upload new videos. To start this video off, we are of course going to look at Nintendo's flagship character, Mario, who actually has a much stranger origin story than you may think. This all starts with a failed arcade game called Radar Scope that came out in 1980 and only managed to sell 1,000 of its 3,000 total cabinets. This left Nintendo scrambling, as they didn't want to lose money and knew they had to salvage these cabinets and change them into something else. Nintendo's president at the time, Hiroshi Yamauchi, tasked a young and inexperienced Shigeru Miyamoto with converting the leftover cabinets into a new game that would sell well in North America. His original idea was to use Popeye and base the game on the love triangle between him, Olive, and Bluto, but when they failed to acquire the rights to the character, they changed things into a gorilla, a carpenter, and just a normal woman. Miyamoto would eventually settle on a game where Jumpman would platform up a series of ramps and ladders, trying to rescue Pauline from the clutches of the titular character, Donkey Kong. This title and the 1980 release, Space Panic, are the creditors of spawning the platforming genre, which at first was called climbing games, as the character would have to progress up the screen to win. Nintendo saw the Jumpman character as one that could be played in any game, and would change his name, somewhat unofficially, to Mr. Video, which Miyamoto would admit later was a terrible name and would have killed the franchise. How the Mario name came to be stemmed from Nintendo Japan asking their American branch if they wanted to change the character's name to fit in more with the Western localization of the game. As a bit of a joke, they thought it would be funny to name the character after their landlord, Mario Segale, who looked a lot like the design, as he was an overall-wearing Italian-American handyman. 2 years later, Miyamoto would give the character his own unique franchise in the Mario Bros. Arcade game that added his brother Luigi in a 2-player experience where you need to defeat every single enemy on the screen through different rounds. Of course, nowadays, we all know that his home debut came in Super Mario Bros. For the NES, where the character really cemented himself in history, and where Nintendo has proven themselves time and time again to be the go-to company for platforming games. The next franchise we're going to look at is one of my all-time favorites in the Legend of Zelda series, whose origins start with Miyamoto wanting an adventure game to release alongside the Famicom system. With help from co-developer Takashi Tezuka, the idea was to create a game that could encapsulate similar themes to that of the legendary Lord of the Rings novels, while incorporating treasure hunting moments that felt like something out of Indiana Jones. Because of this, the game ended up with its massive overworld map with equally large dungeons to explore, and Nintendo had to come up with the revolutionary idea of including a battery-backed RAM in the physical cartridge itself. This was a huge deal at the time, as up to that point, companies relied on a simple password system to allow people to return to their gameplay. The creation of Link's name actually came up halfway through the game's development, as the original idea was to have the character travel between 2 different time periods, which of course would become a staple later in the series, where he was the literal link between the 2 worlds and the only person who could save everything. Believe it or not, Zelda's name was one of the very last things that was decided, as Miyamoto knew he wanted to name the game The Legend of something, and couldn't quite figure out what to put there. Apparently, with the help of an American PR team, they came up with the name Zelda, which was the famous author's F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife's name. They picked this as she was said to be a beautiful woman with a name that sounded pleasant and significant. After the immense success of the Mario platforming entries and Zelda's open-world adventure experience, Nintendo had the idea of combining both genres while adding action elements to create a brand new type of experience. Co-developers Satoru Okada and Yoshio Sakamoto said that their biggest influence was the space science fiction franchise, Aliens. Not only naming the game's antagonist after the movie's director, Ridley Scott, but also basing their main character off Sigourney Weaver's Ripley, who is also a strong female who kicks some alien butt. Eventually coming up with the name Metroid, which is a combination of the words Metro and Android, Nintendo would make this title stand out from similar shoot-'em-up platforming games at that time, as it is non-linear in nature, meaning that you'll have to retrace your steps after upgrading your weapons and skills to progress further throughout the world. The game would go on to sell just over 2.5 million units. Although not as much as Mario or Zelda, it was still enough to allow for future releases and eventually become a staple character for Nintendo. Of course, we've sort of already gone over the creation of Donkey Kong, as the arcade game really boosted the character to become a household name. Although Popeye's Bluto Nemesis was his original inspiration, King Kong can also be credited, not only because of his name, but also due to the fact that he kidnaps a woman and takes her to the top of a structure. Even though his name is in the title, he was not a playable character throughout the first 8 entries in that original arcade series, which started to become outdated once the more comprehensive NES entries began to be produced. When the SNES came out, Nintendo saw this as an opportunity to reboot the series into a true platforming adventure, and tasked British game developer Rare to create an entry full of 3D graphics and models. This was a huge departure from Nintendo's usual practices at the time, as they almost never let outside companies work with their intellectual properties, let alone one set in the Western market where they could have little to no influence on the final product. In the end, it was decided that the original arcade character was actually this version's grandfather, meaning that Cranky Kong is the actual Mario-hating ape, and his grandson is the much more lighthearted savior. Rare would change several other aspects of the franchise for the better, and of course, we know now that Donkey Kong Country was a huge success, and is one of the best series hands down on the SNES. The next franchise origins we're going to look at is the Fire Emblem series, that started off as a hobby project by a group of Japanese students, which over time grew to one of the most popular JRPG tactical series of all time. The idea behind the franchise started when creator, Shaozu Kaga, wanted to develop a simulation game that had tactical fighting elements mixed in, where the player would actually care and try to protect the characters they're playing with. The idea was eventually brought to Intelligent Systems, who had originally been tasked by Nintendo to port games from the Famicom Disk System to the NES, but wanted to create their own types of games, specifically, tactical ones. With Kaga staying on as the game's scenario writer and designer, Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light was created late in the Famicom's history, and was in direct contrast to the company's first game, as it was set in a more mythological past, instead of Famicom War's militaristic present day. Sales were extremely rough at first, as it was heavily criticized by reviewers as being too difficult to understand. But given a bit of time and through word of mouth, fans found that they appreciated the gameplay, and it eventually went on to sell a respectable 330,000 copies. The creation of the Kirby franchise is actually somewhat strange, as Masahiro Sakurai was developing a game and couldn't quite decide on the main character, so he just put a blob in as a placeholder. Over time, the designers at HAL Laboratory grew to love this blob, and would name it Popopo initially, where the first Dreamland game was actually going to be titled Twinkle Popo in Japan. When the game came towards the end of its development, the blob's name was changed to Kirby, and oddly, Sakurai years later has stated that he has forgotten why they settled on that specific name. Two theories to why this might be the case include it being named after the Kirby company, which manufactures vacuums, which would definitely explain his inhalation abilities, or he might be named after John Kirby, who was the Nintendo lawyer during their lawsuit against Universal over the Donkey Kong, King Kong similarities. Now, it is kind of questionable that Sakurai suddenly forgot Kirby's naming origins, and it's more likely that he and Nintendo don't want anyone coming and claiming Kirby as copyright. The next franchise we're gonna look at is Mario's longtime nemesis, Wario's, who is created exactly for that purpose. Making his debut as the final boss in Super Mario Land 2, the 6 golden coins, Wario was another character Nintendo based off Popeye's Bluto, essentially made to be Mario's opposite. This isn't only seen as his symbol as an upside down M, but also because Warui in Japanese means bad, opposed to Mario being the good guy. Apparently Strombelli from Pinocchio was another huge influence on the character, which definitely explains where his gruff nature and maybe even his baldness comes from. Now, oddly, I couldn't find much information to why Wario became the main character in Wario Land, Super Mario Land 3, but I'm assuming they felt that he was interesting enough to carry his own franchise. The origins of Yoshi's franchise actually stems from Shigeru Miyamoto wanting Mario to ride a horse during the original trilogy on the NES system, but because of the limitations of the time, they just couldn't quite get it to work. That's why when Super Mario World for the much superior SNES console was being developed, designer Shigefumi Hino was tasked with going through Miyamoto's old sketches to come up with a character that would fit into the Mario world. With that SNES entry being based on Dinosaur Land, they decided to go with a reptile-like buddy that had a very long tongue that could eat fruit and even enemies. His name Yoshi stems from it meaning good luck in Japan, but apparently some sources list his full name as T. Yoshisor Mucha Koopas, although I think that only refers to one in specific and not all of them. Nintendo would eventually like this companion so much that they made him the main character in the second Super Mario World entry, basing the entire game around the mechanics of licking up enemies to create throwable eggs. The Star Fox franchise is the next origin story we're going to look at, and its creation has some very strange twists and turns. It all started when small British-based developer called Argonaut Games wanted to create titles for the Game Boy, but were unable to find a development kit, so they instead had to illegally reverse engineer their own. When Nintendo caught wind of this through their development of a 3D space shooter called X, they were impressed with the feat, as the Game Boy at the time was seen as an uncrackable system. This started a relationship between the two companies, and led to the creation of a state-of-the-art graphics chip called the Super FX chip, that would allow for 3D environments on the SNES, something that the system's processor wasn't able to achieve. Nintendo badly wanted to show off the chip, and came up with the idea of their own 3D space shooter, initially called SNES Glider, and gave Argonaut Games the job of developing the title with their help. Shigeru Miyamoto saw the final product as more of a tech demo, and completely redesigned it into a rail shooter. That's when the idea of including anthropomorphic characters came to fruition, with early concepts including Star Wolf, Star Sheep, Star Fox, Star Sparrow, and Star Hawk. Miyamoto would eventually settle on a fox, after visiting the famous Fushimi Inari Taisha Shrine in Kyoto, which is associated with foxes, including many statues and monuments to the animal. The next franchise we're going to look at is the massively popular Pokemon series, that has a very humble origin, created by Satoshi Tajiri. After establishing Game Freak with a group of friends as a magazine company in the 1980s, they would eventually transition into developing video games, being hired by Nintendo to create titles like Yoshi and Mario and Wario. When Tajiri saw the Game Boy at a showcase, and noticed its ability via link cable to communicate between systems, he saw it as a perfect opportunity to put an idea for a game he had for quite a while into motion. Growing up in rural Japan, exploring forests and capturing different insects to study, he knew he wanted to recreate that kind of adventure, where the player would explore a large world, capturing different beings and battling them against others. This idea was eventually pitched to Miyamoto, who loved the concept and lobbied heavily for its creation, which definitely helped development get started. The idea was to exploit the system's communication abilities, creating two separate titles in the same world, encouraging people to use the link cable so they could trade monsters and battle each other. The development, however, was an absolute nightmare, almost bankrupting the company and forcing many employees to quit, and Tajori having to take no salary while working incredibly grueling hours. To just finish the project, Game Freak had to get help from Creatures Inc., formerly known as Ape Studios, that bought a 33% stake in the company and the rights to the merchandising that led to the trading card game that we all know and love today. Up next in this video, we're going to look at the Animal Crossing franchise, which has very simple beginnings, inspired by creators Katsuya Iguchi's life experiences. When he was 21 years old and freshly graduated from university, Iguchi moved from his hometown of Shiba to Kyoto to be closer to Nintendo's headquarters. Being alone in a new city around new people gave Iguchi the idea to create a game in the same vein, where your character moves to a new location and has to establish new relationships and a sense of belonging. After working for Nintendo on several projects including Super Mario Bros. 3, Super Mario World, Star Fox, and Yoshi's Story, he was finally able to bring his vision to reality, albeit on the N64 DD add-on peripheral that Nintendo thought would be revolutionary as it greatly increased data storage, internet connection, and a real-time clock. This clock, using date and time, would become the main mechanic of the game, where characters and environments were affected by it, leading to very unique experiences depending on those two variables. Although it was seen as revolutionary, the N64 DD was an absolute failure, so not many people played the game. On top of that, it was entirely in Japanese and had a lot of in-game text, which was incredibly hard to translate into English due to several Japanese nuances, including holidays, that Western audiences wouldn't understand. Eventually, it would be ported for the GameCube in North America, which required immense translation and cultural changes, which essentially made it a brand new experience. Up next is the origin of the Luigis Mansion Ghost Hunting series, which was originally created as a tech demo for the GameCube in 2000. Just meant to show off the graphical capabilities of the system, Miyamoto grew to love the idea of a ghost hunting Mario title, and that Luigi should be the star. This is mainly because of the game's completely different feel than the usual Mario platforming genre, and they were worried when fans would first play this game, they would get way too confused. Definitely inspired by the exploration of dungeons from the Legend of Zelda series, Nintendo wanted to combine that with something completely different that they'd never tried before, and this was the result. One of the strangest Nintendo franchises with an equally weird origin story is Pikmin's, which was created by Miyamoto himself during a point where he really wanted to clean up aspects of his life. Known by many at the time as an avid gambler and smoker, Miyamoto decided to quit all those bad habits for a much simpler life, relying on the pastime of gardening to fill the void. One day he noticed a group of ants carrying leaves back to their colony, and had the idea of creating a godlike game where you would look after two characters, appropriately named Adam and Eve, who would multiply by themselves over time. The development team definitely struggled to figure out what direction to take the game in, but once the Pikmin characters were added and they saw them carrying objects on the screen as a team, just like in the Mario 128 tech demo, then things completely changed. Up next, we're going to look at the Mario Kart franchise, which was created as Nintendo wanted a two-player racing party game for the SNES console. F-Zero at that time was already a big hit for the company, but was seen as too complicated and not user-friendly enough for people of all ages to enjoy. Believe it or not, Mario wasn't added to the game until very late into its development, as Miyamoto recognized that it was too hard to distinguish certain riders apart from others, so introducing familiar faces made things much more simple. This was definitely a good idea, as it made the game easier to sell to general audiences, allowing them to rack in the big bucks. One franchise's origins that I couldn't find too much information on is Mario Party, where all I know is that Nintendo wanted to make a kid-friendly, Monopoly-based board video game. Hudson Soft was tasked to develop the title for the N64, using the Mario series characters as the different players, incorporating fun minigames to play between each round to collect coins. I really wish I knew more or could even find more information on the exact origins of the franchise, so if you have more insight than me, then please let me know in the comments below. The final franchise's origins we're going to look at is that of the Super Smash Bros. Series, which stemmed from a fighting prototype created by Masahiro Sakurai and Satoru Iwata. This game initially starred no mainline Nintendo characters, instead going under the moniker Dragon King, the fighting game during its development, based on Namco's The Outfoxies. However, when Nintendo saw what the pair were working on, they insisted that their franchise characters be the playable fighters to add a better atmosphere and hopefully become a console hit. Initially, it was just meant to be a Japanese-only release. However, through word of mouth and through Nintendo Power magazine, fans demanded for a westernized version, and this would definitely pay off as they sold over 5 million copies worldwide. Alright, that's going to be it for today's video, guys. I really hope you did enjoy this one. If you did, please leave a like, comment below what you thought about it, and of course, subscribe to my channel. Also, I do have an Instagram at Copycat Gamer, so go give me a follow. There I upload some cool clips and items from my collection that you won't see anywhere else. Hope you guys all have a good day, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!